Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm your professor, Randy Kearns, and this week I want to go over continuity and recovery. Just a couple of things I want to be sure and hit before we get started. Actually, let me put up the um, opening slide so that that will be our um, background for what we need to get started with. So just a couple of things. This week, the only thing due is a quiz um, and a certificate. And the certificate is the Independent Study 1300 course. And IS 1300 deals with continuity of operations um, and is basically a reflection of two earlier courses that had been combined into one. The best way to think about continuity of operations is in the aftermath of a disaster, a key part of the recovery is allowing your business or your government function to continue to work in the way it's intended. And sometimes that can be very difficult. Certainly it was with the pandemic. It has been at times with hurricanes. And so, again, a part of continuity of operations is to help establish that baseline of what are the things that we need to do next. One last thing I want to be sure and remind you of, there's a fairly large paper due at the end of the semester. It's due May the 13th. We're now about 17 days from the end of the semester, and I just want to be sure that you're mindful of that. If you would, just take a look a couple of weeks in advance and see that final assignment hanging out there. That is one thing that you need to get completed. And if you have some soft time this week, because we only have this presentation and one independent study course and a small quiz, now may be a good time to get the paper started. So with that said, let me go ahead and pull this over. And let me stop sharing that screen and start sharing this screen. Okay, so the other thing I'll mention is I have a lot of slides in this slide deck, but most of them are hidden because they're not as, if I'm teaching a larger recovery course, then I use a lot more of the content. For your quiz and for this class, I've trimmed that down quite a bit just to be sure that we hit the basics of what recovery is. And so let's kind of start out by talking about the three defining elements of what a disaster is. It's sudden, it's unexpected, and there's typically some type of significant destruction or adverse consequence, whether it's human in nature or it's economic consequence. And in most cases, it's a little bit of both. You may hear the word catastrophe. It's important to point out that we typically use the word catastrophe when a substantial amount of the infrastructure has been damaged and limits a government's ability to care for its citizens. Those terms are not absolutely set in stone, that we speak of one in one manner and the other in another, but you're more likely to hear the term disaster when it impacts the economy, or it impacts humans, or some combination of the two. We're more likely to use the word catastrophe when it's a disaster, meeting the definition that I just previously mentioned, and there's a significant loss of infrastructure. We see that a lot in earthquakes, and we see that a lot in coastal towns impacted by a hurricane. We see it also in small towns where a tornado goes through the middle of town and destroys significant amounts of the infrastructure. And then, so that's what a disaster is. Recovery is that process of restoring, rebuilding, and reshaping really whatever area was impacted. And that could be whether it's the economy part of it, or the environment, but it's all of those pieces. It's all of those pieces that really start the moment the response phase ends. And the response phase ends, so remember, we have 4 phases of emergency management: the planning and preparedness part, the response, the recovery, and the mitigation. And quite honestly, the largest window in the cycle is planning and preparedness. The really shortest window in the cycle, but we probably spend the most effort on, is the response. And then an area that really doesn't get as much attention, but certainly has a great deal of importance, is recovery. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then as we finish, we'll actually break recovery apart into 2 pieces: short-term recovery and long-term recovery. And then once we're at the point post-disaster that we're able to look back on it and start thinking of ways that we can prepare for that in the future, we roll in mitigation. And mitigation can come almost hand in hand during long-term recovery as we look at how are ways that we build back in a more resilient way. And so disasters aren't all terrible in the fact that there can be some positive outcomes. Number one is hazard mitigation. The levee system around New Orleans is as robust as it's ever been, and that's because of what happened during Hurricane Katrina. So as horrible as Hurricane Katrina was, it did leave us with a far better prepared city. We're still not where we should be, but we're far better than where we were. Education. It's safe to say people know more about disaster planning and disaster preparedness, at least not just in New Orleans, but in the Gulf Coast area, because of all of the storms that have impacted the area. And so the education component of it is a matter of people understand how catastrophic things can be and understand what the impacts can be. And there is a window of opportunity after the event to look for ways to make things better, potentially increase investment, look for people to come into an area that there are people who leave an area after a disaster, but that also may create a new window of opportunity for somebody else to come in and set up and function, operate a new business. And then early on in the aftermath of a disaster, there tends to be a decreased level of social conflict. Particularly after 9/11 was a great example of how we were probably more united as a country in 2001 and 2002 than we were in the years before, and certainly than we are right now. And so again, a disaster can have a unifying effect. Now, there are also negative outcomes to a disaster. Number one, the substantial loss of the environment, particularly as it relates to things like a hurricane, where we've lost substantial amounts of shoreline in areas that have been lost to erosion, or areas that have been lost to salination, and thus destruction of certain ecosystems. Socially vulnerable populations, one of the greatest impacts of Hurricane Katrina was the fact that, there was a lot made of how many people just didn't evacuate after they were told to evacuate. The reality was there was more than 100,000 residents in New Orleans who had no personal form of transportation. And so, that is a social vulnerability. If your only transportation is public transportation, and public transportation is not available for an evacuation, and even if you evacuated, it was unclear exactly where to go. Again, it gets back to that addressing socially vulnerable populations. Now, again, we've done a far better job of that today. We know where to go. We have those plans in place, but they weren't nearly as accurate or as impactful as what could have been available in 2005. And then long-term or permanent closures of businesses. All we have to do is there are a number of empty buildings in and around New Orleans that have been empty since 2005. Whether there's an array of businesses that were lost in New Orleans East. Six Flags continues to be an eyesore. Now it's under there's some development plans going for it, but if we look around the Central Business District, the tallest tower in New Orleans, or one of the tallest towers in New Orleans that sits next to the Superdome, has been vacant since Katrina. And so when you have that type of closure of business and you don't have that build back, we're population wise, we're only at 75% of where we were before Katrina. And when people don't come back, they're not there to invest in business, and they're not there to start up new businesses. So you wind up with that reduced investment. And when you wind up with reduced investment, in some cases, you can wind up with increased social conflict. And you see that areas that are not as well protected as other parts of the city. I mean, it's common knowledge that dialing 911 in one part of the city gives you a different response time than dialing 911 in another part of the city. And again, a part of that is a balance that city leaders have to strike that's well above my pay grade, but it does help us understand what type of social conflict is out there. And we can see that right now in the aftermath of the pandemic, where the amount of what's considered petty crime is substantially higher, but also what's considered armed conflict is much higher right now than at any point in the last 5 years. So again, our four elements of the cycle: the preparedness part, the response, the recovery, and the mitigation. And the elements that we want to focus on are the elements of recovery. We've got the physical recovery, we've got social component of that, how people interact with each other, the economic component of that, and that goes to continuity of operations. And again, that's what the IS 1300 is all about. And the environmental recovery: what are things that we can recover to, again, build back better than it was before. Stages of recovery: again, the recovery phase starts the moment the last rescue takes place. And then there's short-term projects and long-term projects. Short-term recovery is designed to create temporary housing, reopen roads, build back bridges or culverts, but come up with ways that people can get around areas that have been washed out. And short-term recovery is usually a matter of days or weeks, or in some cases, a couple of months. The long-term recovery is really looking at how to build back damaged projects at a much greater rate and a much more suitable rate. Again, if we look at New Orleans before Katrina and after Katrina, the long-term recovery component of building back the levee system was a $14 billion project. There's some substantial projects that were a part of that overall program. And that said, they could have, one of the recommendations, the recommendation from the Dutch engineers, was to spend closer to $45 billion protecting the city. And so, again, the short-term pieces are just getting access to areas. The long-term piece is to build it back stronger and more resilient. And again, in terms of stages of recovery, there's the emergency phase, and that restoration is really that short-term recovery. And then the Reconstruction 1 and the Reconstruction 2 are really another way to look at long-term recovery. And again, back into this disaster recovery process is to understand, the restoration phase is really that early fix, quick fix. What can we do? Patch, putting a blue tarp over your roof. Reconstruction 1 is replacing the roof. reconstruction 2 is if the house was destroyed, replacing the house. And then as far as stakeholders go, who's out there? It's certainly public organizations, but there are quasi-governmental organizations, and that includes colleges and universities. There are nonprofits. The Red Cross is a great example of the nonprofits. And then the private sector, if we look at just what a couple of the sports teams, the Saints and the Pelicans have done and continue to do for the community, there's organizations that are out there that are certainly profitable and private for profit, but they certainly contribute to the community in terms of trying to put it in a better position in recovering from a disaster. So in terms of federal agencies, we really start with something called the Stafford Act, and that's at the federal level. And the Stafford Act really directs all federal resources. And I really want to talk about this from a federal, a state, and a local approach. And so let's start with what the federal government does in the aftermath of a disaster. So it flows from the local up to the state to make the request, and the state to the federal government, and then flows back down from the federal government to the state, to the local, to either approve or deny. And if they approve the request, we'll talk a little bit more about what they bring if they do approve the request, or when they approve the request. Again, all of this is based on something called the Stafford Act. Robert Stafford was a senator from Vermont, basically put together a bill that focused on the aftermath of a disaster. And that's the key to it, the aftermath of a disaster. Remember, the people who primarily do the planning and the response that's really at the local level. The people who do the recovery, that starts at the local level, but to be quite honest, the people with the most resources and the biggest checkbook to come in and provide the type of financial support that's necessary to recover from a disaster comes from the federal level. As a former member of the federal government who would respond on one of these types of events, we're the last to get there and we're the first to leave. At some point, we're going to turn it back over to the local government. We're the last to get there because, when they dial 911, they don't call us. The federal government is not designed to be a first response organization. That's really a local level and a state level. But at the point that the locals and the states are overwhelmed and certainly need resources, that's where the federal resources come in. But there's 3 disaster assistance programs that are activated that's a part of that. And those are key pieces of the recovery component. IAPA and hazard mitigation. So IA is individual assistance, PA is public assistance, and hazard mitigation. And we'll talk about all of those programs because they have a substantial amount of funding that's tied into what they do. So again, with the PA program, the whole point to the PA program is to look at how to help the local government and the state government pay for some of the things that they're doing. And if they need resources that they don't have, what can the federal government bring in? In some cases it includes military deployment, but military deployment is always a last resort. There are a lot of barriers to bringing in the U.S. military, and there's a lot of very good reasons why we try not to do that. But sometimes things are overwhelming, as they were during Hurricane Katrina, where they were brought in. Let me not get too far ahead of myself. So a key resource guide for federal response. Again, the whole point to this is to look at what the federal resources can be provided. And again, first response is at the city level and the community level. Once the city and the community is overwhelmed, they call for mutual aid, and that occurs across the state, and sometimes it occurs between states. But at whatever point the state feels like it's overwhelmed by a disaster, that's when the state requests assistance from the federal government. With Katrina, there was a pre-landfall designation of a disaster, but just to give you an example, I had already been spun up as a part of a state response, and our state, the state of North Carolina, we'd been requested to deploy a field hospital for the state of Mississippi. And they didn't know if they were going to be impacted, but they wanted us put on alert. We were put on alert, and we actually stayed in North Carolina for 7 days after the hurricane until they identified a place for us to come in and set up our hospital. But that was a state-to-state request for mutual aid. Again, back to the federal government, they don't, at least at that time, they didn't have a process in place to pre-deploy assets, particularly when you don't know exactly where the hurricane's going to come ashore. So until the state of Louisiana could tell the federal government what resources they needed and where they needed them, there were actually several thousand people that were pre-positioned in Atlanta, and they actually took them through training for a couple of days while they were waiting out deployment orders. Now, if I'm in New Orleans looking out at the rest of the world thinking, where in the world is my help? And hearing that my help is still in Atlanta in a hotel being trained on, PAPPG, and at this particular point it was section 321, 322, and 323. That sounds like nonsense to me, but that was not a part of their obligation. Now that has changed since then, but it still gets back to all disasters are local and all initial response comes at the local level. And I will say at the state level and at the local level, in both Orleans and Jefferson Parish, we're in far better shape than, at least I wasn't here at the time, but I'm told we're in far better shape than we were in 2005. And the public assistance part really is broken apart into two pieces: emergency work and permanent work. The emergency work of debris removal really gets back to just clearing the road so that you can access what's going on. In other words, it's very difficult to get a fire truck down a highway that sits near the coast if there's a stretch of electric poles that are laying across the highway. So the first debris removal has to really be to clear the road so fire trucks, EMS, law enforcement, whoever's the public safety responders can actually get down the road. So, and again, FEMA will provide resources if that's what's needed, but early on, in most cases, states and local governments have contracts in place to get that debris removed. And really the role of the federal government is to write a check for that and to be sure that whatever millions of dollars are needed to be able to get that happening immediately, that's done. And so that's what debris removal and emergency protective measures is really to pay for overtime for the police, the firemen, the paramedics. So that's what emergency protective measures are. Debris removals, clearing the highways and so that you can access and provide rescue. Emergency protective measures are those emergency things that need to be done by emergency personnel. And then the permanent work, actually, again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So this is the emergency work. Again, those immediate life threats, protect, improve property. And then the category B, permanent work, are typically things that take place over an 18-month time frame. And I'm sorry, that's category C through G. But the whole point to that is those are longer term projects. Some of them may need some immediate repair, such as a culvert washed out. To be able to access a community, we may authorize an immediate repair of a culvert. And in some cases, we wouldn't even need to authorize that. The parish or the state would authorize that, and they would in turn just turn to us, and we would either pay for it or reimburse what they paid for it. And then again, it's an 18-month time frame. As I mentioned earlier, we start completing something called an incident action plan, an IAP, really the day we start the deployment. And one of the first parts of the planning cycle is to also plan for your devolution, to spin down the operation. Because again, the federal resources are the last ones to arrive and the first ones to leave. Well, that's because it's, ultimately the people in New Orleans and the people in the state of Louisiana, you're going to be here after other people are gone. And so, as soon as we can get things back to a point, the federal government can get things back to a point that they can turn them over to you, the better off. Because, having somebody here from pick another state, they don't understand and don't typically know what the local needs are. And so, early on, we rely on that input from the local services, the local providers. But again, once the immediacy has passed, and once we get started with some of those short-term projects, they get completed, and get started with some of the long-term recovery projects, we'll start to bow out. We'll leave a small handful of people behind. I'll just give you an example. My first mission assignment was 2004. There were 4 hurricanes that struck Florida over a period of about 8 weeks, and they had 4 presidential declarations for different parts of the state. And that was my first deployment as a reservist. And my last deployment as a reservist was 2011, and it was for a series of tornadoes that came through the state of Georgia. And we had moved to an operations center that they had a team of logistics personnel who had gone in and set up this operations center for us. And I was talking to one of the guys about, they set this thing up in about 72 hours. It was really fascinating how quickly they had turned empty space into usable office space. But one of the guys was kind of wrapping up. I said, where are you off to now? He said, I'm going to Orlando. And I said, what's happening in Orlando? He said, well, the joint field operation is being downsized again, and we're moving them again. And to kind of put that in perspective, again, that was 7 years after the disaster. They still had a small group of personnel that were, and I'm sure there were probably people in Louisiana in aftermath of Katrina 5, 6, 7 years later, but they're more in an advisory capacity or more in an approval capacity for expenditures than they are in making key decisions. As much as they can avoid making key decisions, they try to, because again, it's a local disaster, and the federal government is only here to help support that local response. So in addition to the public assistance, there's also the individual assistance. And I've got to, if you want to see more about this, I've included the slides, but I've grayed them out for this presentation. But the point is to help people recover individually following a disaster. There's some short-term pieces to it and some long-term pieces. It certainly doesn't make you whole. Your first recourse is through insurance, but this is intended as a stopgap measure to help individuals in the aftermath of a disaster. And one of the key pieces is the housing program. What are ways that we can help people get back into housing without making them relocate to other parts of the state or of the nation? The biggest challenge in the aftermath of Katrina is literally 200,000 people that at least for a time did not come back to New Orleans, that evacuated from New Orleans. In some cases, they couldn't afford to come back. In some cases, they chose, I just don't want to go through that again. And so, a part of individual assistance is to try and help people stay in their homes if they can, and look for ways that they can at least stay locally while they rebuild and refinish their home. And there's again, back to the large resources that only an organization that the federal government has the types of financial resources, if they bring them to bear, that can be provided in the aftermath of a disaster. And this is just some of those examples. Now, when the federal government sets up a field operation, they also bring in other federal agencies to help. You know, in some cases, it may be replacing a Social Security card. You think about all of the little things that you may lose in the aftermath of a disaster, and trying to be sure that you're not impacted any more than is absolutely necessary. You know, there are an array of federal agencies that do come in to provide assistance in a something we call a joint application center. It's a joint location where a number of federal agencies come together to be sure that you've got someone you can talk to about your services, whether it's veteran services or USDA if you have farm subsidies. But anyway, to be sure that other services are there, but that's available. One other one that I didn't include in that is the Small Business Administration. And although it has the name Small Business Administration, which is an important part of your business continuity planning for your business, they also make low interest disaster loans for homeowners and renters. And so if you've lost your housing or a substantial amount of your housing has been damaged, you're eligible for a low interest loan for an extended period of time so that you can, again, build back and support what you need to be able to return to your home or return to your business. There are a number of people who are underinsured. There are a number of people who have extended fights with their insurance on what was covered, what wasn't covered. And then again, having another way that you can help fund some of that through the SBA is helpful to know. There's something called emergency support functions. I know you've been exposed to this by now through the independent study courses. The 15 common ESFs, we actually have added ESF 16 and ESF 17. Here in Louisiana, those are optional ESFs. But if you hear ESF something, that's what this is related to. Again, I'm sure you've seen this before, but these functions are typically staffed at the state level, and FEMA will assign someone to assist with what's going on in the command center, but this is really a command and control function that's done at a state level. For Louisiana, as an example, it's done at GOSEF in Baton Rouge. Actually, I've been there a couple of times during the pandemic. This is a stood up, functioning, active part of what's going on and has been going on in state government for over a year now. And then again, on the state side, the governor's office for Homeland Security and emergency preparedness is GOSEP, and that's again, that's the State Emergency Management Agency. Typically that person reports either directly to the governor or in a very close connection to the governor. You have other elected officials, and certainly you have other state agencies involved. The Department of Public Health plays a big role here, and the Louisiana National Guard plays a very big role here. In some states, they play a lesser role because they have a lot of civilian support. Louisiana, being a smaller state in terms of population, rely heavily on the Guard. I've had some extraordinary experiences in working with guardsmen that are very well trained and very knowledgeable about understanding their role with emergency management and emergency preparedness. A number of things that each state is responsible to do. I won't go through each of these, but just again, federal government's last to arrive, first to leave. As the feds stand up and start approving things or start going out and giving presentations. Again, a part of that is to look to a state counterpart who will carry this on whenever they leave. Most federal employees deployed to a disaster are deployed there in cycles of no more than about 45 days. And again, if, whenever I was assigned to a disaster, I would be paired with somebody from a state agency. Once we got through some of the big stuff of being sure what was approved and what we would pay for, we started working on a transition plan so that, you know, at some point, your federal representative is leaving and the state representative is here to continue to administer the program. And as you can tell by these responsibilities, the individual assistance, public assistance, and headers mitigation are key pieces of that. The governor's office, probably the big thing here is, and I know you've seen this before in some of your earlier independent study work, but that's the role of the governor in requesting for a declaration of disaster and that interface with the president, because the state has to request a presidential declaration of a disaster, and it's for each state, even if so let's use Hurricane Katrina as an example. The disaster that impacted Louisiana had a different number and a different set of assignments to it than the disaster that impacted Mississippi. Same storm, but it was a different number, a different system. And the point was to recognize each state by its own boundaries and to look for ways to support that state. And so that is why you'll see different levels of resources coming into each state, depending on what each state requested as a part of their initial contact with the White House. States have an obligation to establish a rainy day fund. They have to come up with what's called a non-federal match. All of the money that I've talked about before, the typical relationship is a 75 to 25 match. So for every dollar spent, the federal government pays 75 cents of that. In some cases, the state may pay 25 cents. In some cases, the states pay 12.5%, and the local parish pays 12.5%. And then that 75% can be more than that under certain circumstances. With the pandemic as an example, for certain components of the pandemic, the federal government has said, we're going to pay for that 100%. There's no local match. So it just varies from disaster to disaster. I mean, I'd love to tell you there's rhyme or reason to it, but there's really not a lot of rhyme or reason to it at times. And then other government actors include the local government, the local parish. I've got Orleans here just as an example, but if you live over in Jefferson Parish or St. Bernard or Plaquemines Parish, all of those have some type of a city manager or mayor, but somebody who has some type of, has the ultimate responsibility of declaring a disaster and assigning somebody to work with the state officials and the federal officials if that applies. A lot of building code and local floodplain management and a local emergency manager, those are key actors at the local government. And then different types of planning organizations exist out there, and different type of, again, what's NGOs or quasi. NGO is a non-governmental organization, or quasi-governmental organizations are out there. And then things that they can do, again, there may be some regional planning organizations. We have them in the healthcare, something we call the Healthcare Coalition, where a number of parishes are bound together by some common events and common elements, and develop plans and develop processes for dealing with disaster. And then there are other professional organizations that may also be able to provide some expertise bring in additional assistance and provide some guidance in what's going on. They can also be involved in the recovery, and there's a number of associations out there that will provide some either voluntary participation and assistance, or in some cases they're compensated for their assistance, but they are available and they do make themselves available to us when we know there's a disaster that's going on. And colleges and universities play a big role, or can play a big role. You know, we have a program at the University of New Orleans called CHART, and the CHART program has a lot of, they actually have several grants associated with hazard analysis, floodplain management, and mitigation type grants. And so again, a part of it is to you know, and just like you as a student taking a course like this, a part of this is to make you mindful of what type of resources are available, and to hopefully help turn you into a resource. What are things you can do to help yourself, help your business, individual planning, business planning, and business continuity, and help your community? If you can help yourself and you can help your business, in many ways you are helping your community, because they don't have to worry as much about you as they can worry about somebody else. And then nonprofit relief organizations, really some of the big ones out there. The American Red Cross is certainly one of the larger ones, but there are a number of not-for-profit community organizations that exist in the greater New Orleans area that do provide substantial assistance, because we do have a significant number of underserved population in our area that are at great risk during a disaster. And then what type of international aid organizations? That's typically not as well connected to the United States as to other smaller countries. But you know, and as we saw after Hurricane Katrina, there was international aid that did come to both Louisiana and Mississippi. But again, that was a really dramatic catastrophe that was really unusual in nature. Private sector and business corporations, again, what are things that they can offer? One of the big pieces about businesses and corporations can include lending institutions. What can they do in terms of providing financial assistance? And then other parts of it can get down to the point of media, but you know, that first part about debris removal and contractors and consultation, you know, in the aftermath of a disaster, you'll wind up with a lot of construction workers coming in. A part of government is to try and figure out how to vet them, and hopefully they've got a process in place to predetermine who are people that can come into the area. Otherwise, you really wind up with, in some cases, some really shoddy work, or some work that is prepaid and incomplete, or not completed. And then what else is out there in terms of groups or individuals? Again, a part of this is to look for ways to pay it forward. How can we learn from the past and improve our response in the future? And that creates a bit of a recovery assistance framework, both at the public level, but certainly at an NGO level or at a community activist type level. Other parts of assistance can be both funding, or it can include framework assistance in terms of how do we help the local community recover. And then I've included kind of the sliding scale of, if you're dealing with government, your rules are much higher, but probably less understanding of the local need. And the more you're likely to deal with the local need or understand the local need, the more likely you're going to be associated with local governments and local nonprofits. And then this is kind of an overlay of how policy is kind of one of these flat trends that exist throughout a disaster. There may be some slight adjustments in the aftermath of the disaster policy-wise, but for the most part, policy is pretty stable. The technical assistance comes in quickly, but then slowly begins to fade away in the aftermath of a disaster. The other piece about funding is funding also is substantial in the aftermath of a disaster, but also fades away pretty quickly. And that's why it's incumbent upon states and local governments to understand what the rules are and to look for opportunities to be able to collect the funding that they need, that they can justify to help pay for the types of damages that were done, and to rebuild it better than it was before. The recovery planning, again, there's pre-disaster planning tools. The post-disaster evaluation also includes that long-term recovery. It's also important to recognize this in the planning process. And the disaster recovery plan includes policies, the legal authorities, if there is a local recovery committee, and then some type of implementation strategy. And then the topical elements, what are the things that are needed? And then it's also important to think about, what type of negative outcomes can be there. Because again, you only get one chance to get this right. And if you, let me go back to this slide just a minute. If you don't do your planning in advance, you don't have some type of strategy in advance, you're not cognizant of the cost associated with the work that needs to be done, you wind up with a missed opportunity, and you seldom get a chance to go back and say, I missed that, but I'd like to have more money. You typically get one chance to ask that question, and when you don't, that gives you that poor coordination, that poor outcome. If you don't have good local participation, there are a lot of negative outcomes that can come from that. And so a part of having understanding what your disaster plan needs to be, both for you individually and your business. And if you work for government, the role of government in disaster planning is also how do you set yourself up to be able to recover from the disaster. And again, if we kind of recap this, recovery starts the moment the last rescue is completed, when the response phase ends. Recovery really isn't one of those things that is embraced as much, because it's not as attractive as response and rescue. It's typically overlooked and underfunded. Short-term recovery is designed to kind of get by. How do we get by with this situation? But it's important that we call that a short-term fix, because the long-term recovery is really to build it back better. And to build it back better, we have to recognize what's a short-term fix and what's a long-term build back better proposition. And sometimes that includes bringing in hazard mitigation dollars, but it's also being mindful of what the big picture is, and to be sure that you're saying the same thing over and over again, because you in the aftermath of a disaster, you will wind up talking to more than one person and being sure that your message is heard. And then federal response focuses more on the recovery phase, because that's really what the federal response is all about, is to help a community recover. The federal government really is not a first response organization. It's called leaning forward now. They try to lean into a disaster now as best they can to pre-position resources and personnel, but the tip of the spear is still the local community. It's still the local state actors and the state response. And so at some point, that federal agency, whenever they arrive, they're there to do all they can to help that local community. But at some point, they're going to leave, and the local community is going to be left with whatever, with whatever's still there. So The local community needs to understand what you need and what you have, and that gap analysis of the difference between what you have and what you need, and express that clearly and mindfully and financially, so that you can get that reimbursement, so that you can make those purchases and make those repairs, so that later on, if you are impacted by disaster, you're not as impacted as substantially as the last one. And with that, I'll say we're done. As I say, I've got a substantial number of slides in this presentation. If you want to pull it down and look at all of them, you're certainly welcome to do so. But the main piece of this presentation today is just to help you understand the importance of recovery, both for you individually and your business, as well as how any type of an organization fits into the bigger picture following a disaster. With that, let me call this to an end. And again, I'll remind you one more time, if you have some time this week, now would be a good time to get started on your paper that's due May the 13th. You do have a big paper due at the end of the semester. It's never a bad time to get started on it. Now's a good time. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you back here next Monday at 4 o'clock.